Imagine being in a mall, just going about your day, when suddenly you're accused of something you didn't do. That's exactly what happened to Mrs. Clara Bennett, an elderly woman who was harassed by security officers, but little did they know, her son was about to show up. What happened next left everyone stunned. Stay tuned to find out how this dramatic story unfolds. Before we begin this story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? We love hearing from viewers all around the world. The story begins with Mrs. Clara Bennett, a 72-year-old kind and dignified black woman, spending a quiet afternoon at the local mall. Known for her warm demeanor and gentle presence, Miss Clara enjoyed shopping independently, despite her age. Her soft gray hair framed a face that carried years of wisdom, and her cane tapped softly on the tiled floors as she made her way through the aisles. Her shopping cart held simple essentials: bread, milk, fresh vegetables, and her favorite chamomile tea. As she approached the checkout area, she paused to take a deep breath, savoring the peaceful moment. Little did she know that this ordinary day would take a shocking turn, leaving her shaken and forever changing her life. What happened next would test her strength and resilience. As Mrs. Clara Bennett prepared to leave the store, her peaceful shopping trip took an unexpected and disturbing turn. Two security officers, both towering men dressed in stern uniforms, abruptly blocked her path. Their expressions were cold and accusatory. Startled, Mrs. Clara looked up at them, her soft gray eyes widening in confusion. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you," one of the officers said sharply, folding his arms as if to emphasize his authority. Bewildered, Mrs. Clara asked gently, "Is something wrong?" Her voice carried a tremor as her heart began to race. Without hesitation, the second officer replied in a harsh tone, "We've received reports that you've been shoplifting." The words hit her like a blow. Mrs. Clara, who had always lived with integrity, was stunned. "That's not true," she said, her voice quivering as she clutched her cane tighter. "I paid for everything." Determined to clear the misunderstanding, she reached into her shopping bag with shaking hands and pulled out her receipt. Despite her effort to prove her innocence, the officers barely glanced at the paper. One of them responded curtly, "We need you to come with us," ignoring the clear evidence in her hands. Mrs. Clara's heart sank. "Please, check the receipt. I've done nothing wrong," she pleaded, her voice tinged with desperation. But the officers were unmoved. Without further explanation, one of them grabbed her arm firmly. The sudden action made Mrs. Clara flinch, nearly causing her to lose her balance. "Let me go," she begged, tears welling in her eyes as she struggled against their grip. The officers continued dragging her toward the back of the store as a crowd began to gather, whispering and watching. Mrs. Clara felt a wave of humiliation and fear wash over her. Her tears flowed freely now, her quiet dignity shattered. In that moment, she felt utterly powerless, with no one stepping forward to help or even question the officers' harsh actions. Mrs. Clara Bennett, visibly shaken and overwhelmed, found herself dragged through the store by the security officers as a small crowd gathered nearby. Her quiet cries for help were drowned out by the murmur of onlookers, who chose to whisper among themselves rather than intervene. The humiliation was unbearable. Mrs. Clara, who had always carried herself with dignity, was now being treated like a common criminal. Her cane wobbled in her grip as she struggled to keep her footing. The officer's hands, rough and unyielding, held her arms tightly, leaving her unable to break free. "Please, I've done nothing wrong," she begged, her voice trembling. Tears streaked down her cheeks as her purse, hanging loosely from her shoulder, began to slip. Suddenly, her phone tumbled out of the bag, hitting the floor with a soft clatter. Mrs. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Her son, Nathan, had always told her to call him in an emergency. With desperation overtaking her fear, she reached for the phone, her frail hands trembling. The officers, preoccupied with pulling her toward a back room, didn't notice. Around her, the crowd continued to watch, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. No one stepped forward to question what was happening or to offer her assistance. Mrs. Clara felt utterly alone in that moment, her humiliation deepened by the silence of those around her. With trembling hands, Mrs. Clara Bennett managed to retrieve her phone from the floor, her heart pounding as the officers continued to drag her toward the back of the store. Desperation fueled her movements as she unlocked the phone and dialed her son, Nathan. The call connected after only a few rings. "Mom?" Nathan's deep, steady voice came through the line, instantly grounding her amid the chaos. Tears streaming down her face, she whispered, "Nathan, please. I need you. They're hurting me. I don't know what to do." Her voice cracked with fear and humiliation, but she knew he would understand. "Hold on, Mom. I'm coming. Don't worry, I'll be there," Nathan replied firmly, his tone filled with both urgency and reassurance. Mrs. Clara clutched the phone tightly as the call ended, her hope now resting on her son. Within moments, Nathan, driven by a mix of rage and determination, was on his way to the mall, ready to protect his mother and make things right. Nathan Bennett arrived at the mall within minutes, his heart pounding with a mix of rage and urgency. Parking hastily, he scanned the area until he spotted his mother. What he saw made his mother turn. Mrs. Clara, frail and tearful, was being dragged by two security officers toward a back room. Her face was streaked with tears, and the sight of her struggling between the two large men ignited a fire in Nathan's chest. Steeling himself, Nathan approached the scene with a calm but commanding presence. A former Marine and now a respected police captain, he knew how to take control of tense situations. "Mom!" he called out, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Mrs. Clara's tear-filled eyes snapped to his, relief flooding her expression. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice trembling. The officers turned to face him, clearly annoyed. One of them puffed up his chest and said curtly, "Sir, this doesn't concern you. Step back or we'll have to call the police." Nathan's jaw tightened as he suppressed the rage bubbling beneath the surface. He calmly reached into his jacket and pulled out his badge, holding it up for all to see. "I am the police. Captain Nathan Bennett, 9th Precinct," he stated, his tone sharp and unyielding. The officers froze, their faces draining of color as they realized the gravity of the situation. They stammered excuses, trying to justify their actions, but Nathan cut them off. "You've accused my mother without evidence, ignored her proof of purchase, and assaulted her in front of witnesses. Now, release her immediately," he commanded, his voice firm. Calming the officers quickly let go of Mrs. Clara, who stumbled slightly but was caught by Nathan before she could fall. His protective arm around her, Nathan fixed the men with a piercing glare. "You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs about this," he said coldly, his words heavy with authority. The crowd, previously silent, began murmuring in awe as the officers hung their heads in shame. Nathan led his mother away, his focus now solely on ensuring her safety and comfort. Nathan Bennett, calm but seething with controlled anger, stood firmly in front of the security officers who were still gripping his mother's arms. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his badge, holding it up with precision. "Captain Nathan Bennett, 9th Precinct," he announced, his voice steady but laced with authority. The officers froze, their expressions shifting from irritation to shock. The weight of what they had done became apparent in an instant. Their faces turned pale as the realization set in. This wasn't just an upset bystander. This was a high-ranking police officer. "Release her! Now!" Nathan demanded, his piercing gaze fixed on them. Without hesitation, they let go of Mrs. Clara's arms, stepping back awkwardly. One of them attempted to stammer out an explanation. "We were just doing our job. We didn't know it." "You didn't know?" Nathan interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through their excuses like a blade. "You didn't think to check her receipt? To listen to her? You chose instead to harass and assault an elderly woman in front of witnesses. Is that what you call doing your job?" The officers stood silent, their heads lowered in shame. unable to meet Nathan's steely gaze. The crowd, which had grown larger, watched in stunned silence, the tension palpable. Nathan turned to his mother, his expression softening as he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked gently. Mrs. Clara, her voice still trembling, nodded slowly. "I am now, thanks to you." Turning back to the officers, Nathan's tone became icy again. "This isn't over. Expect a full investigation, and you'll be held accountable for your actions." The officers nodded mutely, their earlier bravado completely deflated. Nathan then guided his mother out of the store, ensuring her dignity and safety. Nathan Bennett turned back to the officers, his expression hard and unwavering. "You didn't bother to check her receipt, didn't ask questions, and instead treated an elderly woman with complete disrespect," he said, his voice low but sharp with authority. "You've humiliated her, manhandled her, and ignored her proof of innocence all in front of a crowd." The officers stood frozen, their earlier arrogance now replaced with visible regret. One of them tried to mumble an apology, but Nathan silenced him with a piercing glare. "What if this had been your mother? Would you still have acted this way? Think about the harm you've caused not just to her, but to yourselves and the integrity of your job." He leaned in slightly, his tone icy. "This isn't going to be swept under the rug. You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs, and I'll personally ensure there's a full investigation. Actions like yours don't go without consequences." The officers nodded meekly, their faces pale and ashamed. Without another word, Nathan turned his attention back to his mother, placing a protective arm around her. "Let's go, Mom," he said gently, guiding her away with dignity, leaving the officers and the crowd in stunned silence. As Nathan Bennett led his mother, Mrs. Clara, out of the store, he could feel the tension in her trembling hand resting on his arm. Her tear-streaked face bore the weight of humiliation and fear, and it made his heart ache. "Mom, I'm so sorry this happened to you," he said softly, his voice tinged with both anger and sorrow. "You didn't deserve any of this." Mrs. Clara, still shaken, looked up at her son with a faint, grateful smile. "Thank you, Nathan," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "I didn't know what to do. I was so scared, but you came. You made it right." Her words were filled with both relief and pride, though the pain of the ordeal lingered in her eyes. Nathan stopped for a moment, gently turning to face her. "You're safe now, Mom. They'll be held accountable for what they did, I promise." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his protective presence helping to ease her distress. Though comforted by his words, Mrs. Clara couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. The memory of being treated so cruelly would take time to heal, but knowing her son stood by her gave her a sense of solace and strength. Together, they walked out of the mall, the ordeal behind them but its impact still echoing in their hearts. As Nathan Bennett guided his mother out of the mall, the weight of the ordeal began to lift. The crowd that had once stood in silence now murmured with a mix of respect and shame, realizing the gravity of what had unfolded. Nathan, resolute, ensured Mrs. Clara that justice would prevail. "Their actions won't go unpunished," he reassured her. "Internal Affairs will investigate, and they'll be held accountable for what they've done." Mrs. Clara nodded, a hint of relief softening her tear-streaked face. Though the pain of the experience lingered, the thought of justice being served gave her a small sense of peace. She held her son's arm tightly, grateful for his unwavering support and determination. As they left the mall together, the ordeal had left scars, but dignity had been restored. The promise of accountability and Nathan's fierce protection ensured that Miss Clara's voice had been heard. As the story comes to a close, we want to thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Stories like Mrs. Clara's remind us of the importance of standing up for justice and supporting one another during challenging times. If you found this story impactful and want to hear more real-life accounts of resilience, courage, and accountability, Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll become part of a community that values truth and powerful storytelling. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest content. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and join the conversation in the comments below. Your thoughts and voices are what make our stories meaningful. Together, we can shine a light on important issues and inspire change through the power of storytelling. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.